She wasn't begging. She was hungry. But when the billionaire saw his black maid kneeling by the trash with food in her hands, he didn't see a woman. He saw a crime. Would you have fired her too, or fed her? Tell us below. The mansion's kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the freezers. Stainless counters gleamed under the lights, polished so clean they mirrored every movement. Near the trash bin, a beautiful hot black woman, age 30, with dark brown skin, crouched on the cold marble floor. Her name tag read Keisha Williams. She held half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, her fingers shaking as if each bite could cost her life. What the hell do you think you're doing? The voice shattered the still air. Ethan Hart, the billionaire owner, stood in the doorway in a tailored navy suit, fury tightening his pale jaw. Two kitchen staff froze. Keisha flinched, but didn't drop the sandwich. I was just hungry, sir. He strode forward, shoes clicking like a gavel. Hungry? In my house? You have access to the pantry, the fridge, staff meals, and you chose the trash? She tried to stand. Her knees slipped. It was still wrapped. It wasn't spoiled. I just hadn't eaten since yesterday. Ethan's tone cut colder. That's your excuse? You think you can take whatever you want because you wear a uniform here. Behind him, someone whispered, maybe she steals more than food. The gossip spread like smoke. Keisha's throat tightened, but she said nothing. Her stomach growled loud enough to betray her silence. I trusted you in my house. Ethan snapped. My office, my rooms, and this is what you do? He snatched the sandwich and threw it back into the trash. The thud echoed. Something in her broke then, not her will, just her dignity. She lowered her head to hide the tears that burned her eyes. I wasn't stealing, she said softly. I just needed something to keep me standing. Stand outside, he ordered. You're done for today. Her chest heaved. Please don't fire me, sir. I'll clean every floor in this house twice. Get out. She rose slowly, eyes fixed on the floor, so he wouldn't see the wet tracks on her cheeks. A trickle of blood ran from her arm, where broken glass had scratched her. No one moved to help. She left the kitchen in silence. The staff pretended to work, but their eyes followed her until she disappeared. Upstairs, Ethan stormed into his office. The anger on his face had something else. A flash of memory. A teenage boy digging through a dumpster behind a diner, searching for day-old bread. He blinked it away. He wasn't that boy anymore. Downstairs, Keisha washed her hands with trembling fingers. Blood mixed with soap and water. She wrapped her arm in a paper towel and stared at her reflection in the chrome faucet. Her dark skin gleamed under the light, beautiful and exhausted. For a moment she saw herself as they did, a servant who didn't belong. Then she whispered, I just needed one bite. The noise of plates and voices faded as she walked the hall to the servants' quarters. She sat on the edge of her small cot and clutched her phone. No messages, only a photo of her mother in a hospital gown. Her thumb traced the image as tears slid quietly down her face. In the dining hall above, Ethan ate dinner prepared by the same hands he had just humiliated. Each bite felt heavier than the last. Across the table, his assistant spoke about a charity fundraiser for the poor. He nodded mechanically, but inside something uneasy stirred. The echo of her voice. I was just hungry. That night, rain tapped against the mansion windows. Keisha lay awake, listening, her stomach aching from emptiness. The pain wasn't new. What hurt was how familiar it felt, being judged for surviving. She clutched the small cross around her neck and murmured, I won't break. Upstairs, the billionaire stared at his reflection in the dark glass. A man surrounded by riches but haunted by the image of a black woman by his trash and the truth he couldn't escape. She'd been skipping meals so her mother could breathe. Would you have fired her too, or fed her? Tell us below. The night after the humiliation stretched endlessly. The mansion slept, but Keisha Williams, a beautiful hot black woman age 30 with dark brown skin, couldn't close her eyes. She sat on her narrow cot, the hum of the generator mixing with the quiet ache of hunger. The paper towel wrapped around her arm had bled through again, a thin red line marking the wound no one cared to notice. On the table beside her lay a torn envelope, her last pay stub. 90% already gone, wired straight to Palmetto County Regional Hospital in South Carolina. Her mother's name was printed at the top, Gloria Williams. Heart surgery. Urgent. She lifted her cracked phone, screen glowing faintly in the dark. "Mama, are you awake?" she whispered. No reply, just a message from hours earlier. "Still here, baby. Pray for me." Keisha swallowed hard, fighting the burn in her throat. She had promised her mother she'd make it out, that she wouldn't let being black, poor, and female decide her worth. But tonight, every promise fell heavy. By 5 a.m., she rose for work as if nothing had happened. The uniform clung to her skin. Hunger made her lightheaded. When she entered the kitchen, conversation stopped. The same people who'd laughed the night before suddenly found something else to do. She tied her apron and began scrubbing counters. Every stroke of the sponge was a prayer. "Don't let me lose this job. Don't let them see me cry." Mrs. Carroll, the senior housekeeper, walked in quietly and set a mug of coffee beside her. It wasn't pity, it was respect. Keisha wrapped her fingers around the warm mug, inhaling steam instead of drinking. It was enough to stop the shaking. Hours passed. The smell of bacon and toast filled the air, the same smell that mocked her empty stomach. She kept wiping surfaces, pretending she couldn't feel her body fading. The door swung open. Ethan Hart entered, crisp suit, perfect silence. He didn't look at her. He went straight to the espresso machine. "Make sure the guest suite's spotless," he said flatly. "Yes, sir," she murmured, eyes down. She turned to leave, but her vision blurred. The room tilted for a moment. She caught the railing, steadied herself, and climbed the stairs. Halfway up, her knees trembled. The world dimmed, edges fading gray. Her chest burned as if she'd run miles. Still, she kept moving. Her thoughts were slow but sharp. If I fall, they'll call me weak. If I rest, they'll call me lazy. She pushed through the dizziness, gripping the rail until her knuckles whitened. She entered the guest suite, opened the curtains, and sunlight cut across the floor. Dust swirled in the air like ghosts. She smoothed the bedspread and straightened pillows, pretending the silence wasn't heavy. On the dresser sat a framed photo of Ethan shaking hands with the governor. Keisha stared at the smile frozen in glass. "You ever missed a meal, Mr. Hart?" she whispered. "Ever prayed for food instead of money?" A knock startled her. Mrs. Carroll again, soft voice, kind eyes. "You all right, child?" "Yes, ma, Kai Shalit." Carol's eyes fell on her wrists, thin and trembling. "You need to eat." "I will." Carol hesitated, then slipped a folded bill into her palm. "Lunch. My treat." Keisha wanted to refuse, but Carol's tone left no room. "Don't argue with Grace," she said and walked away. Keisha stared at the $10 bill. It wasn't charity, it was humanity. For the first time in days, someone had seen her. She stepped outside during her break. The cold air stung, but it felt clean. She sat on the back steps, unwrapped a sandwich from the staff pantry, and ate slowly. She didn't taste the bread. She tasted survival. Above her, through the glass windows, Ethan's reflection moved past, unaware. Two worlds separated by a pane, one fed, one fasting. Keisha looked down at her hands, trembling but steadying with each bite. She whispered to herself, "One day, you'll see who I really am." And for the first time since that night, she believed it. The footage showed the truth, and it shamed him forever. Would you have fired her too, or fed her? Tell us below. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. Gray light filled the mansion windows, dull and heavy like guilt. Ethan Hart sat alone in his office, a man built by discipline and pride, staring at his reflection in the glass. Behind that reflection, the truth waited, silent, patient, unforgiving. He couldn't get her voice out of his head. "I was just hungry." He'd told himself he was right to be harsh. That order mattered. That reputation mattered. But every time he blinked, he saw her again, a black woman on the floor, shaking hands, clutching a sandwich she never finished. He loosened his tie, pacing the room. Outside, rain tapped the window. Inside, silence pressed down on him. He picked up his phone and saw a message from his PR director. Investors confirmed dinner. You'll announce the Feeding America campaign tonight." He stared at the words, irony cutting through him like a knife. Feed America. He couldn't even feed the woman who worked under his roof. He set the phone down. "God, what have I become?" he whispered. The door opened softly. Mrs. Carroll stepped in, calm as ever. "Sir," she said carefully, "may I speak freely?" Ethan nodded, rubbing his temples. "It's about Keisha." He froze. "What about her?" "She's been working double shifts since last night. Hasn't touched food all day." He looked up sharply. "That's her choice." Carol's voice held quiet fire. "No, sir. That's desperation." He turned away, jaw tight. "You think I overreacted?" "I think," she said, choosing her words, "you saw what you wanted to see, not what was really there." Her honesty stung. For years, people around him only agreed. But Mrs. Carroll didn't need her job. She cared more about her soul than her salary. "Don't forget where you came from, sir," she said gently. "You built everything from nothing. Maybe that's why this hurts you more than you'll admit." When she left, the silence became unbearable. Ethan stared at the empty chair she'd stood beside. His reflection on the dark window stared back, rich, powerful, hollow. Memories he had buried long ago surfaced. A younger Ethan, 17, sleeping in a car. Cold nights, cheap coffee, a diner owner shouting, "No scraps for thieves," as he'd reach into the trash. The shame, the hunger, the vow. One day, no one will look down on me again. He whispered the empty room. I became him. Determined. He sat at his desk and pulled up the employee files. Keisha Williams, age 30, clean record, excellent references, not one complaint. He opened payroll logs, then froze. 90% of her salary wired every month to Palmetto County Regional Hospital. Recipient, Gloria Williams. Relationship, mother. Diagnosis, cardiac surgery. Ethan leaned back, throat tightening. She wasn't greedy. She was keeping her mother alive. He pressed the intercom. "Drew, pull the kitchen camera footage from last night. All angles." "Yes, sir," came the voice over the speaker. Minutes later, Ethan stood in the dim glow of the security room. The monitors flickered to life. There she was. Keisha entered the kitchen quietly, looking around. She checked the counters, the fridge. Everything she touched, she cleaned again before leaving. She poured leftover soup into a container labeled for him, for Mr. Hart. Reheat at noon. He blinked, watching her neat handwriting, her discipline even in hunger. Then, when the staff had left, she turned back toward the trash bin. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid and pulled out a sandwich, still wrapped, untouched. He leaned forward, breath caught. She unwrapped it slowly, tears glistening under the fluorescent light, then took one small bite, not like a thief, like someone praying for strength. When the footage ended, Ethan's reflection stared back from the black screen. His throat burned. She hadn't stolen a thing. She'd hidden her pain so she could work one more day. He sank into the chair, hands over his face. "Dear God," he muttered, voice breaking. "What have I done?" He sat there for a long time, the rain whispering against the window, the weight of his choices pressing on his chest. He had built a world of luxury, yet somehow forgotten what humanity felt like. The footage looped once more. Keisha wiping the counter, straightening the chair, turning off the lights, leaving quietly. Dignified even in desperation, Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes wet. For years, he'd been proud of being self-made. Now, for the first time, he saw the cost. The boy who once ate from trash had grown into a man who punished others for doing the same. He whispered the only truth that fit the moment. She wasn't stealing. She was starving. He hit stop on the player and stared at the frozen frame. Her face half-lit, eyes tired but strong. That image wouldn't leave him. Not tonight. Not ever. She didn't fall from guilt. She fell from hunger. Would you have fired her too, or fed her? Tell us below. The next morning, the mansion was too quiet. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves knew what had been done. Ethan Hart hadn't slept. He sat at his desk, the same footage playing again on loop. Keisha's trembling hands, the sandwich, the silence that followed. Every replay stripped away another layer of the man he thought he was. By noon, he still hadn't eaten. His untouched breakfast sat beside him, cold. He pushed it aside, grabbed his keys, and walked toward the kitchen. The staff froze when he entered. His presence was never casual, but today it felt different. Uncertain, human. "Where's Keisha?" he asked. Mrs. Carroll looked up from the counter. "Cleaning the stairway, sir." She refused to rest. He exhaled, guilt tightening his chest. "Tell her to stop working. She needs to eat." Carroll hesitated. "Sir, she hasn't eaten since yesterday morning." Ethan's throat went dry. He turned and walked out. Keisha was halfway up the staircase, wiping the railing with one hand, gripping the banister with the other. Her skin glistened with sweat. The mansion lights blurred above her. She tried to focus on emotion. Wipe, step, breathe. But her arms were heavy, her legs weaker than she wanted to admit. Ethan stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Keisha." She didn't hear him at first. When she finally looked down, her vision flickered. "Yes, sir." "Put that down," he said. "You need to sit." "I'm fine," she insisted, still wiping. "Keisha," his tone softened. "Please?" She forced a smile. "Don't worry about me, Mr. Hart. I've worked through worse." Then the rag slipped from her hand. Her knees buckled. For a second, it looked like she might catch herself. But the world went black before she could. Her body crumpled against the railing and hit the marble floor with a sound that silenced the house. "Call the doctor," Ethan shouted, sprinting forward. He knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. "Keisha, Keisha, can you hear me?" Her pulse was faint. Mrs. Carroll rushed over with towels, trembling. "Oh, Lord, she's burning up." Minutes felt like hours before the doctor arrived. He checked her vitals, then looked up at Ethan, voice grim. "She's severely dehydrated, malnourished. She hasn't eaten properly in days." Ethan's jaw clenched. "You mean she—" "Yes," the doctor cut in. "She fainted from hunger. Her body simply shut down." The word struck harder than any insult. Ethan's chest felt hollow. "Take her upstairs," he ordered quietly. "Now." They carried her to the guest suite, the same one reserved for visiting executives. Now it was for the woman he had once thrown out. Ethan followed close behind, unable to look away. He noticed every detail. The small cut on her arm reopened, the shallow breaths, the soft rise and fall of her chest. When they laid her on the bed, Mrs. Carroll whispered, "Sir, she's tougher than she looks. But she can't keep going like this." Ethan nodded slowly, eyes glassy. "I know. This is my fault." The doctor mixed an electrolyte drink and handed it to Carol. "She needs rest and food. She'll wake up weak, but she'll wake up." When the room cleared, Ethan sat alone beside her. He watched her sleep, her breathing uneven but steady. Every minute that passed added weight to his silence. He wanted to apologize, but the words stuck like stones in his throat. The clock ticked softly, marking each second of his regret. At last, he spoke under his breath. "You were right. You weren't stealing. You were surviving." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the guilt too heavy to hold. For the first time in years, the billionaire who had everything felt powerless. Hours passed. The lamp's warm light painted soft gold across the bed. Keisha stirred, eyes fluttering open. Her voice was hoarse. "Why are you here?" "Because I should have been sooner," he said quietly. She tried to sit, but he gently pressed her shoulder. "Don't move. You need strength first." Her lips cracked into a faint smile. "You should have fired me." "I should have fed you," he answered. She stared at him, words lost between disbelief and exhaustion. Tears pooled in her eyes before she turned her face away. He stood slowly. "Rest, Keisha. I'll make sure you're taken care of. That's a promise." He paused by the doorway, glancing back one last time. The woman he had broken now lay under the same roof. But for once, she wasn't beneath him. She was the mirror of his conscience. That night, Ethan didn't go back to his office. He sat in the hallway outside her room, listening to her faint breathing through the door. He whispered to himself, "This ends here. Tomorrow, the maid I shame will run my house. Would you have fired her too, or fed her? Tell us below." Morning sunlight crept through the tall glass windows, touching the edge of the bed where Keisha Williams lay weak but breathing steady. Her dark brown skin glowed faintly in the light. The bandage on her arm was clean now, her lips no longer pale. She opened her eyes to find Ethan Hart sitting in the corner, his shirt sleeves rolled up, face lined with guilt. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The billionaire who once shouted her into silence now looked small, human. She tried to speak, but her throat burned. "Why are you here?" "Because I should have been sooner," he said quietly. She turned away. "You shouldn't feel sorry for me, sir." "I don't," he replied. "I feel sorry for myself." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. He stood and poured water into a glass, holding it out. "Drink." Her fingers trembled as she took it. Their hands brushed, a brief touch, heavy with everything unspoken. He hesitated before saying, "I watched the footage." Her breath caught. "You weren't stealing," he continued, voice low. "You were starving. And he paused, searching for words that didn't sound hollow. "I treated you like something I swore I'd never become." Keisha looked at him through tired eyes. "And what's that?" "A man who forgets hunger." The silence stretched. She turned her face to the window. "I didn't want your food, Mr. Hart. I just needed a little mercy." He nodded slowly. "You deserve more than mercy." He reached into his jacket and placed a sealed envelope on the nightstand. "That covers your pay for 6 months, in advance, and your mother's hospital bill, paid in full." Her head turned sharply. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. "You kept her alive while I was busy pretending to help strangers." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You think money fixes what happened?" "No," he admitted. "But maybe what I do next can start to make it right." He took a deep breath. "When I was 17, I worked nights washing cars. I slept in one of them most days. The diner down the street threw out leftovers. I used to wait till midnight to eat from their trash. One night the owner caught me. Instead of calling the cops, he brought me inside and gave me a job. That man changed my life. And yesterday, I became everything he taught me not to be." Keisha studied his face, the raw truth in his voice. "So what now?" she asked. He straightened his shoulders. "Now I fix this." He met her eyes, the shame gone, replaced with quiet resolve. "I can't erase what I did, but I can change what happens next." He stepped closer, his tone firm but gentle. "Starting tomorrow, you're not a maid anymore. You're the house manager. You'll oversee every department, every account, every person here." Her lips parted in disbelief. "You're promoting me?" "I'm honoring you," he said. "You've earned more loyalty than anyone in this house." Keisha tried to laugh, but it came out as a weak breath. "You really think a new title can clean what's been broken?" "No," he said softly, "but maybe it can show the world what dignity looks like when it stands back up." Mrs. Carroll entered quietly with a tray of soup, overhearing his words. "About time, sir," she said with a smile. Ethan chuckled faintly. "I figured you'd approve." Keisha looked between them, unsure whether to cry or smile. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered. "I'll earn it," he replied. "Every day if I have to." He turned to leave, stopping at the doorway. "You once said you hadn't eaten since yesterday. That won't happen again, not here, not ever." She called after him softly, "Mr. Hart?" He turned. "Thank you." He nodded once. "No, thank you for reminding me what being human means." When he left, Keisha sank back against the pillow, tears finally breaking free. The morning light filled the room, warm and soft, not like forgiveness, but something close. She reached for the envelope, held it in her hand, and whispered, "Maybe God really does hear silent prayers." Outside the window, Ethan walked down the long hallway, feeling something he hadn't in years, peace. The kind that comes only when pride dies and truth finally breathes. Power doesn't reveal who you are. It reveals who you've always been. Would you have fired her too, or fed her? Tell us below. The weeks that followed changed everything inside the Hart Mansion. Keisha Williams, the beautiful hot black woman aged 30 with dark brown skin, was no longer the maid people whispered about. She was now the house manager, moving through the halls with quiet authority and a calm, steady voice. Where shame once lived, purpose had taken root. The staff watched her differently now, some with respect, others with jealousy. But Keisha didn't care for approval. She cared for order, fairness, and the silent dignity she'd fought for. Each morning, she stood at the kitchen doorway before sunrise, clipboard in hand. Her routine was simple. Check inventory, assign duties, treat everyone equally. Even Mrs. Carroll, who'd served the house for decades, said the place had never run smoother. But no one rises without being tested. And Keisha's test was about to come. It started with missing inventory. On a Tuesday morning, Marcus, the young inventory clerk, nervously approached her office. "Ma'am, there's a problem with the wine logs again." Keisha looked up. "Show me." The papers were neat, but the numbers weren't. Several cases of imported Bordeaux had vanished from the ledger. Their value alone was more than she earned in a month. "Who signed these deliveries?" she asked. Marcus hesitated. "Chad, the kitchen supervisor." Her jaw tightened. Chad, the same white man who had laughed the loudest when Ethan caught her that night by the trash bin. Keisha's voice stayed calm. "Get him in here." Minutes later, Chad walked into her office, all swagger and smirk. "Boss lady," he said mockingly, dropping himself into the chair without permission. "What's this about?" Keisha slid the papers across the desk. 3 cases of Bordeaux, 2 boxes of truffles, missing from inventory. Your signature's here. He leaned back, grinning. "Probably a mix-up. Happens all the time." She folded her arms. "Then you won't mind explaining it to Mr. Hart." The grin faltered. "Whoa, no need to bother the boss. I'll handle it." "You already did," she said sharply. "By stealing." Chad's smirk returned, colder this time. "Careful, Keisha. Power looks good on you, but don't forget you used to scrub floors here." Her eyes locked on his. "And you used to think no one noticed what you took. Times change." He stood, jaw tight. "You really think you can accuse me and keep your fancy title?" She didn't flinch. "I don't need a title to tell the truth." Before he could speak again, the office door opened. Ethan Hart stood there. "What truth is that?" Chad froze. "Sir, Keisha interrupted quietly. "He's been falsifying deliveries." Ethan's gaze sharpened. "Is that true?" Chad stammered. "Just a paperwork error." "Let's see," Ethan said, motioning toward the hallway. "Security room. Now." They watched the footage together, Keisha, Ethan, and Chad. The monitor showed Chad loading boxes into his car after hours. Clear as daylight. Ethan's voice turned ice cold. "Pack your things. You're done." Chad's face flushed red. "Sir, please." Ethan didn't raise his voice. "You had mercy when Keisha was accused, and you laughed. You're lucky all you're losing is a job." Security escorted him out. The room fell silent. Ethan turned toward Keisha. "You handled that perfectly." She exhaled slowly. "I just did what was right." He nodded. "And that's exactly why you belong here." That evening, the house was alive with noise again. A dinner party, one of Ethan's investor gatherings. But this time, things were different. The staff moved with purpose, following Keisha's quiet commands. Not one plate was late, not one glass out of place. When the last guest left, Ethan lingered by the dining table, still in his suit, sleeves rolled up. "I think that's the smoothest event we've ever had," he said. Keisha smiled faintly. "People work better when they're treated like people." He chuckled. "I'll try to remember that." She was about to leave when he added softly, "You saved this house." Keisha paused at the doorway. "No, Mr. Hart. I just cleaned what was already dirty." Their eyes met. not as master and maid, but as equals, scarred by the same lesson. Later that night, alone in her small office, Keisha unlocked her phone. A message blinked at the top. "Surgery went great. I'm walking again, baby girl. Come home soon." Mom tears filled her eyes. She pressed the phone to her chest, whispering, "Thank you, God." Then she opened her laptop and typed an email to Ethan. Subject: Second Chance Meals Program Proposal. Her plan was simple. Donate all unused food from the mansion to local shelters every week. Feed the city the way she once prayed to be fed. She hit send. 10 minutes later, a reply appeared. Approved. Start immediately. YH. Keisha leaned back, smiling through her tears. For the first time, she felt whole. Downstairs, the mansion lights dimmed. Outside, rain began to fall again. Not heavy this time, just enough to remind her that storms don't always destroy. Sometimes, they wash everything clean. No one gave her a voice. She just stopped whispering. If you believe kindness can rewrite power, common justice wins. A full year had passed since the day Keisha Williams fainted on the marble stairs of the Hart Mansion. Now, she stood in front of a crowd outside a tall brick building in the heart of the city, the Hart Foundation Community Center. A banner above her read, "Second Chance Meals, Feeding the Forgotten." The air smelled of fresh bread and hope. Dozens of families lined up for free meals. Children laughed near tables stacked with boxes. Volunteers in aprons worked beside business executives and college students. It was a sight no one in that city would have believed possible a year ago. A billionaire and his former maid feeding people side by side. Ethan Hart adjusted his sleeves, wiping sweat from his brow. When he noticed Keisha in the crowd, his face softened. He crossed the courtyard toward her. "You came," he said, smiling. "I had to see it," she replied. "The man who once threw away food now feeds half the city." He laughed quietly. "You made it happen. I just funded it." Keisha smiled faintly, eyes shining. "Funny how tables turn." He nodded. "And sometimes they finally stay upright." Inside, reporters filled the main hall. Cameras clicked, lights flashed. Ethan stepped to the microphone first. "This foundation isn't just my project," he said to the crowd. "It's hers. The woman who reminded me what dignity means when no one is watching." He gestured toward Keisha. Applause erupted. People turned their heads, searching for her. She froze for a second, heart pounding. Public speaking was never her strength, but silence had almost killed her once. She wasn't going back to it. She took a deep breath and walked to the front. The applause faded into an expectant hush. "I used to work at Mr. Hart's home," she began, voice steady but low. "I cleaned his floors, served his guests, and one day, I ate from his trash." Gasps filled the room. Cameras zoomed closer. Ethan lowered his head, ashamed but listening. "I wasn't a thief," Keisha continued. "I was a daughter trying to keep her mother alive. I was hungry, not just for food, but for a little kindness." Her tone grew firmer. "That night, I thought my life was over. But sometimes, being broken is how you see what's worth keeping." A woman in the audience wiped her tears. "I forgave him," Keisha said softly, glancing toward Ethan. "Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. And that forgiveness gave me strength. Strength to build something that would feed others like me." She paused and smiled. "Now, every leftover meal from that mansion comes here, to fill plates instead of landfills." Applause thundered. The cameras flashed like lightning. After the event, Keisha wandered through the kitchen, watching volunteers scoop rice and vegetables into containers. A young black boy, no older than 10, stood near the counter clutching a paper bag. She knelt down. "Hey there, sweetheart. You here for your family?" He nodded shyly. "My mom says we can't buy dinner this week." Keisha smiled, packing 2 meals and handing them to him. "Then take one for tomorrow, too. Tell your mom she matters." The boy looked up. "Are you the boss here?" Keisha laughed. "Something like that." He grinned, waved, and ran off. For a long moment, she just watched him disappear into the crowd. remembering the girl she used to be, praying behind a trash bin for one more day of strength. When evening came, the volunteers cleaned up. Keisha stepped outside into the cool air. The sun had set, but the city lights flickered across puddles from last night's rain. She looked up at the skyline, the same one she used to view from the servant's window, and smiled. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. "They showed you on the news, baby. I'm so proud. You did what I always told you. You made noise where silence used to be." Keisha laughed through tears, typing back, "No, Mama. I just learned when to speak." She slipped her phone away, staring at her reflection in the glass door. Not a maid, not a victim, but a woman who had turned humiliation into healing. A reporter who hadn't left yet approached quietly. "Ms. Williams, one question?" She nodded. "What would you tell others who feel unheard?" Keisha looked at the camera, eyes glowing with strength that came from scars, not perfection. "No one gave me a voice," she said slowly. "I just stopped whispering." The camera light blinked red, capturing the moment. Somewhere deep inside her, Keisha knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a louder kind of justice. As she walked away into the night, the foundation sign behind her flickered in the wind, glowing brighter with every step she took.